Okay, so now that we've learned what foundation paper piecing is, let's make our blocks. So I have my fabric already pre-cut here, ready to go, and I've kind of laid it out in the order that I'm going to sew, but it's totally up to you. And I have my template here. One thing to point out about the template is to make sure that you've printed it at 100% and that you test with this 1-inch block. All you need to do is use your ruler and test and put your ruler over it and test to make sure that it's 1 inch. The other thing about this pattern, that template, that's different than the other ones is we're missing the 1/4 inch line, and that's totally okay. We're going to add that in when we finish the block. So let's get started. We're going to take our light box, and with foundation paper piecing, remember you're sewing on the actual line. So your line is going to be on top of your light box and your fabric will be on the back side. So block number 1. And with my pattern here, I've chosen to do a gradient from lightest to darkest, but you can use whatever fabrics you want. So number 1 is here, and you're just following an order. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. So we're going to keep our fabric right sides together. So we're going to put the first one down, the number 1, and then we're going to add number 2, again, right sides together on top. And with this line here, you want to make sure that you leave enough fabric for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That looks about right. And sometimes when you use darker fabric with foundation paper piecing and your light source, it might not be bright enough for you to see it. So you can just kind of pull the fabric back to see, to make sure that you're within your 1/4 inch seam allowance. And for precaution, I'm going to go ahead and pin mine in place. And the more that you do foundation paper piecing, you might find that you don't need to pin, and that's totally okay. All right, so let's take it to the machine and sew it. Again, you're going to be sewing on the line, so you'll want to flip your template over. I've changed out my machine to a lower stitch length to 1.4, and that will help when you go to remove the fabric. I've also changed my needle to the 9014 needle, and then I'm using a 50 weight thread for piecing. So let's lower our presser foot. And we're going to start about a 1/4 inch off of the line that we're sewing on. And then we're going to stop about a 1/4 inch off as well. Okay, so let's remove our pin. And then flip it over, printed side facing you. And then this is where your cardstock would come in handy. You could slide your cardstock in here. Let me grab it. To help crease your line. So you get that nice 1/4 inch seam allowance. Take your ruler, line the 1/4 inch up with the edge of your paper. And I love this ruler because it has the 1/4 inch line already built in. And then you just trim away. And see, there's your 1/4 inch seam allowance. What we're going to do is, I like to give it a little finger press before I actually press it down with my iron. Everything looks pretty good. Take it over here. And my iron is set to hot. Sort of like a cotton linen setting, and it doesn't have any steam in it, because if you use steam with foundation paper piecing, the paper will actually wrinkle. That'll make it a little bit more difficult. Okay, so we have 1 and 2. Let's do 3. Again, we're just sewing in the order of our template. So there's 1, 2, now we need to add our 3rd one. Again, making sure that we have enough fabric for our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Pin it in place, take it to our machine, flip it over. Sewing a 1/4 inch off of that line, and at the very end as well. Gonna remove our pin. Press it back, and see, I've done this a few times, so this one's pretty easy for me. I don't necessarily need the cardstock, but if this is your first time, I would recommend using the cardstock. You could also use a thin ruler if you wanted. Okay, let's give it a finger press. Everything looks good. We're going to press it back. Now we're starting to see this take shape. You can see the gradient. All right, and then we'll add our last little section, which is number 4. And if you notice on this one, the number 4 is actually quite small. So I'm going to shift my fabric over a little bit more to make sure that I catch it. And with your pattern, I've provided pre-cut measurements for your fabric, and I've given you a little bit of extra room. I love to have a little bit of play room when I'm doing foundation paper piecing, just in case you make a mistake. Okay, pin it. This one's quite a short line to stitch. Okay, let's remove our pin. Grab our thing. And see, here's something you want to make sure doesn't happen. You want to make sure that all your fabric is flat and that nothing pops up, because if something pops up, like for example this, and you cut this off, you're actually going to cut the piece off that you just sewed. So just make sure everything's nice and flat. Okay. Give our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Do a little finger press, and this one's a little wobbly because it's a shorter stitch line that we're stitching on, but that's okay, it'll be just fine. Okay, let's add the second half of the tree. This is when you'll see it really start to take the shape of a tree. This little pattern is so versatile, it would be so fun in holiday colors. You could add some red. Okay, so this one is section 5. And you can see here, our line is here that we're going to be sewing on. So we're going to lay this over right sides together still. 1/4 inch. And you want to make sure, because there wasn't a 1/4 inch seam built in to finish the block, you want to make sure that you go 1/4 inch off of each side of these dark lines on the outside. Okay, maybe adjust that a little bit. Pin this guy in place. Okay, flip it over and let's sew it. Starting 1/4 inch off of this line here. Now my sewing machine is going pretty fast, but if you're a newbie to foundation paper piecing, I would probably slow the speed down. And we're going to stop 1/4 inch off. Let's remove our pin. Grab our cardstock, place it along the line we just sewed. Flip our paper over, and this is totally normal. This looks a little weird, but this is actually totally normal. What we're going to do is we're just going to pop these stitches right here along the line. Everything's still in place, don't worry. And then trim away. Do a little finger press. Oh my gosh, it's looking so good. Okay, then we'll iron this back. All right, now we're going to add our background pieces. And it still kind of doesn't look like anything now, but just wait till you trim everything away and it'll look like the finished block here. Okay, so we're at section number 6. So these are our background pieces. I think this would be a really fun pattern to do. Lots of different prints. Really make it scrappy. So make sure we're following this line here for our 1/4 inch. That looks pretty good. Let's pin this in place. I'm just going to pin this in place in a couple of places just to make sure. And then we'll flip it over and just give ourselves a good check. Yep, you're covered. There's a 1/4 inch there, a little bit more. And we're going to take it to our machine and stitch it down. Stopping a 1/4 inch off. Let's go ahead and remove our pins. Trim our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, you're just going to pop these stitches. And trim our seam allowance. A little finger press, make sure everything's okay. And look, you can see the one side of the tree start to take shape. Looks really cool, right? Okay, we'll give it a good press. And then we'll add our last section, which is section number 7. And because I'm using a darker fabric, it is a little bit tougher to see this line. But again, just pull your fabric back. Kind of make sure that you're on the line. And then pin this in place. Do a little flip, make sure we're pretty covered. Looks pretty good to me. And we're going to sew this in place. Sometimes when I'm using bigger sections with bigger fabric, I just pull it back just to make sure nothing's caught underneath. You might get a little bit of ripple, and if so, you just have to rip it out and start over. Make sure I'm still flat. Okay. Remove our pins. Grab our cardstock. Pop a few of these stitches up here at the top. Again, just making sure everything's nice and flat. And then trim our seam allowance. Ah, look at that. Starting to see the Timberland tree. Okay, we're going to press this back. Okay, so final step is trimming around your block. And again, we want to make sure that we're adding in our 1/4 inch seam allowance. So what you're going to do is you're going to place your ruler on top of this line here. And you're going to add in a 1/4 inch. So see, I'm just placing my 1/4 inch ruler line on top of that dark line, outside line. Okay, looks pretty good. Make sure, there we go. And then we're just going to trim this away. And then you're going to rotate and do the same for the other 3 sides. You can save those bigger scraps of fabric for another project. Okay. One more. Make sure we're good. All right, well, pat yourself on the back. You just made a Timberland pattern, foundation paper piece pattern. The next step is to remove the paper. Now there's two things you could do. You could leave the paper in and sew the paper together with the other pieces, the sashing that we're gonna add, or you can remove the paper. For this pattern, I would actually recommend removing the paper, but again, it's totally up to you. If you leave the paper in, you're gonna be following this line because we've already built in our 1/4 inch seam allowance. So to remove the paper, you're just going to remove the paper in the reverse order that you sewed it. So starting with number 7, then we go to 6, etc. And all you do is fold it back, kind of crease it a little bit, and then remove. This is a really fun thing to do in front of the TV, or you could have your kids do it, your spouse. Some of the little tricky pieces that are still attached, you could use some tweezers to get those out. Okay, so that was 6 and 7, and then here's 5. And then 4. Three. 2. And 1. Great, let's get rid of this little thread here. I'm gonna give this block a good press. Just wanna make sure you press and not iron so you don't stretch anything out, because triangles have a little bit of give in them. And there you go, you did it. You made a Timberland foundation paper piece block. It looks really good. So for this pattern, you're gonna need to make 4 total. And then we're gonna add some sashing. So we're gonna do that next.